Hey, welcome to the stream home edition. I'm Josh Rushing, sitting in for Femi OK. Oh, look, see that YouTube box over there, that chat? We actually have a live producer sitting there waiting for you to get your comments and questions to me so I can get them to our guest in the show so we can, do this together. So join me if you will. Give me some questions over there and I'll ask them here in just a couple of minutes. Now, what we're talking about today is actually just kind of breaking this afternoon in Canada. They've declared the Proud Boys a terrorist organization alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which begs the question, why hasn't the U.S.? It's a U.S.-based far-right extremist group. Why hasn't it been declared a terrorist group here? That's something we're going to discuss with our panel today. There is a renewed interest, of course, in domestic terrorism now with the new administration and what happened on January 6th. In fact, I believe President Biden might be the first president ever to mention it in an inauguration speech. Here, listen to this.
A cry for survival comes from the planet itself, a cry that can't be any more desperate or any more clear. And now, a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat.
White supremacy and domestic terrorism in the inauguration speech. Now, here's the thing. The U.S. actually doesn't have a formal law for domestic terrorism. And so the debate is, should it? But as we know from the past, what happens when the U.S. gets expanded powers under the name of terrorism, often it's minority groups in the U.S. who have suffered the most under those new laws. So that's also going to be a part of today's discussion. I want to bring the panel in now. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you, and then we're going to take off here. Colin, can you begin?
I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group.
Thank you, Colin. And Diala?
Hi, my name is Diala Shammas, and I'm an attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and I work on challenging surveillance and discriminatory policing practices.
Hey, thanks, Diala. And Mustafa?
Hi, I'm Mustafa Bayoumi. I'm an author and professor, and I'm joining you from Brooklyn, New York.
So, Colin, tell me this. One, tell our audience what the Soufan Group is. And then two, why doesn't the U.S. have a law for domestic terrorism?
Sure. Soufan Group is a security consulting firm. We do products for a number of clients, looking at a range of security, national security, and homeland security related topics. There's a couple of reasons why the United States doesn't have a domestic terrorism law or statute. One is the concern that politicians or even the president could use that law to target political adversaries. And I think, after the last 4 years, it doesn't take much imagination to see that actually coming to fruition. President Trump on several occasions threatened to designate Antifa, but paid no mention to the range of far-right extremist groups that we saw threatening the Capitol on January 6th, groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, and others.
Right. I want to bring in a comment from someone in our community. This is Charles Lister. He is the director of Countering Terrorism and Extremism in the Middle East Institute. Check this out.
The greatest domestic terror threats in America today arguably come from a combination of the far right and the various aggressive conspiracy communities that have developed and been fueled by Trump. That's arguably being realized through the increasing assertiveness of local and national militia movements and a surge in violent incidents, attempted attacks, and even a recent suicide bombing in Nashville late last year. And then, of course, comes the persistent challenge posed by jihadists, both centrally directed and inspired by the likes of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That's a threat that's clearly not going away. And if anything, the recent surge in law enforcement and intelligence focus on the far right might even present an opportunity for jihadists to operate more freely in America.
So, Mustafa, domestic terrorism, there's nothing new about it. It's been around, but something new happened in 1983, and it's a World Congress of these extremist groups met in Idaho and declared war against the U.S. government. And they trained for that, they raised funds for it, and really the kind of zenith of that was blowing up the federal building in Oklahoma City. Through all these years and since then, the government's never really postured itself against these groups as if it is an insurgency, proper insurgency. In 2009, the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security, came out and said that white nationalism was a leading threat in the U.S., and there was major blowback. What's going on with that? Why does it seem like the government looks the other way on this kind of extremism?
Well, who has paid the price for all of that? And it's largely been Arab and Muslim communities within the United States, because I believe it's just a lot easier to think that the threat is coming from outside. It allows you to feel like you are pristine and that you've been invaded by some foreign adversary. But in fact, as we know, as becoming clearer and clearer, that's just not the case. And not only is it not the case, but there's not enough initiative, there's not enough drive, there's not enough purpose from law enforcement to actually even enforce the laws that we do have on the books. And I think actually trying to introduce new laws on the books will only mean bad news for Arabs and Muslim communities, but not only them, but in fact many other minority communities and activist communities around the country.
Is there a racial component, though, as to why the U.S. government seems to be so proactive in going after what they call terrorism when they see it from basically non-white than from a white guy?
I think there's no question that there's a racial component. And, it's not only the U.S. government. In fact, I think it's really just part of American culture. In fact, even the journalism community, when you have a plot that gets foiled, it makes huge splashy news if it's done by somebody who is affiliated with Muslim communities. And one study has found that that kind of study will get more than 750% more coverage than a similar plot by a non-Muslim. So this is actually a deeper problem than just thinking about law enforcement.
And Diala, is the word terrorism even useful in this regard at all? Or is it part of the problem?
Yeah, I absolutely think that it's part of the problem, because it sort of rids us of our ability to properly diagnose what is going on. And, you started with referencing the Oklahoma City bombing, and I think that's a really good place to start to illustrate the point that every time acts of white violence, white supremacist violence have occurred, the response has actually been to pass laws and legislation. In this case, it was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that primarily hurt brown and black communities, right? That statute ostensibly passed to address the problem of white violence only hurt minority communities. And so that's really, I think, the fear that many of us who've been seeing these long-term patterns have about how this particular moment might be, again, kind of utilized to push these agendas that are ultimately not going to address the root causes of white supremacy, the real problem of white supremacist violence that many of us who work side by side with movements like the Movement for Black Lives and Muslim communities we've had longstanding concerns about the problem of white supremacist infiltration in law enforcement, including and the halls of Congress. So I think our real concern is what do we need to be doing as a government and at law enforcement to properly address the problem of white violence and white supremacy, and passing more laws and giving FBI agents more tools. And expanding the category of terrorism is not the solution. It'll only sort of exacerbate the problem, and we'll see those tools be turned against the more vulnerable elements of the population, namely Muslim communities, as Mustafa said, and Black dissenters primarily, which is also where we've seen a lot of these laws be kind of turned against, the just recent examples of the FBI really focusing on Black dissent and Black Lives Matter movements as a primary targets, and they've even used language mirroring domestic terrorism to talk about those movements. And so that's really where our concern comes from.
Well, talk to me about the idea of defund the police and how it converges with the idea of calling for a crackdown on the kind of people that invaded the Capitol on January 6th. Well, what do you think the government should do?
Well, the notion of, I think the way that the notion of defunding the police resonates here is that it stems from the same fundamental analysis, which is if you have an agency like the FBI or Department of Justice with a really long history of anti-Black, anti-Muslim sentiment at the institutional level as well as at the individual agents level, those of us who've worked representing clients who've had to deal with agents can sort of attest to some of that. The question of why you would try to answer the problem of white supremacy by giving those agencies more tools is sort of an essential one. And I think that's the central question to the defund movement, right? If the call is Black Lives Matter, if the call is that we have institutional racism within these law enforcement agencies, then why would we call for giving them more resources and reform when part of the problem that we're identifying is right there? So I think that's some of the parallel sort of thinking here that's at the core of the critique of these proposals, these policy proposals, these budgetary expansion proposals, and these, adding kind of criminal laws to throw a sort of prosecutorial instinct at a problem that's far worse and far bigger than, some criminals.
I want to bring in someone from our YouTube community. They go by Reverb Twang, and it says, we need to use the laws we already have and arrest the felons. And another person who sent us a video comment, who's a civil rights lawyer at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, named Amam Bukadoum.
Our coalition wrote a letter to Congress and to the administration with over 151 organizations signing on, opposing additional authorities for two reasons. First, there are over 50 statutes and others that already allow for the investigation and prosecution of violent terrorist activity in the United States. Second, those same authorities that are already on the books have been disproportionately used against Black and Brown communities, particularly Black Lives Matter activists, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and others. And we know that any additional authorities will probably be used disproportionately against Black and Brown communities.
So, Colin, are there enough laws on the books already to handle this? Why can't the U.S. declare these organizations terrorist organizations like Canada did today? And if there are enough laws on the books to handle it, then what happened on January 6th? How did this get so out of control?
Well, the U.S. can't declare those groups as terrorist organizations because, as you mentioned in your opener, we don't have a domestic terrorism statute that's the equivalent of an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization statute that the Department of State would put forth. I think for sure we need to start enforcing the laws that we have on the books. We see that, evident from January 6th. There's a double standard. I mean, the other guests have pointed that out. And that's been clear for a long time, I think, in this country. Another aspect of that is, if you look at the Nashville bombing on Christmas Day, this was a person who was reported to police. He was, building a bomb essentially in a trailer. And most people thought immediately, including myself, had that been a Black or brown person or a Muslim, that would have been, investigated and followed up on right away. And that bombing never would have taken place. So all that said, I published a piece in the New York Times 2 Sundays ago talking about the new era of far-right violence. And I do think it's worth exploring at the level of the National Security Council what other tools the authorities need. Because if they're saying they don't have enough tools to combat white supremacist violence, I think it's worth listening to. I think this needs to be a transparent discussion, and I'm willing to have that conversation.
Do you think there's some lessons to be learned from the way, after 9/11, the way the expanded authorities were used in the U.S. against communities of color, particularly those related to Islam?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot that went wrong in the so-called global war on terrorism. First of all, the name itself. Terrorism is a tactic. It makes no sense to declare war against a tactic. Moreover, we didn't really mean all types of terrorism. We meant, terrorism inspired by Salafi jihadists. And that was expanded to the broadest possible definition. And communities in the United States suffered, Americans suffered, and are still suffering. So I think there's got to be an accounting for that. At the same time, I think, the threat that we're looking at now from domestic terrorists and domestic violent extremists, it's far more diverse than what we've been looking at for the last 20 years. We've been looking at a very narrow slice of the terrorism threat. Now we're looking at, anti-government militias, violent conspiracy theorists, and a whole range of other groups and individuals and movements that fall under this broader far-right umbrella.
So I'm looking at our YouTube chat, and there's a a lot of kind of conspiracy theory getting thrown around here. Here's someone who says this is being blown way out of proportion by Dems and leftists. Like a lot of these things, it seems like ideology is at the heart of it. Information is at the heart of it. I want to bring in a video comment from Nafis Hamid. She's a cognitive scientist at University College of London.
We know from our psychology and brain scan studies that it's very difficult to change people's core beliefs, extremists' core beliefs. But what we do find is that they are amenable to peer influence. They're less willing to engage in violence if they feel like their peer group does not approve of it. The problem with deplatforming extremists from social media is that they migrate to other platforms. And then once there, their new peer group all basically agree with them, thus making it more likely for them to engage in violence. So the real question in the long term is going to be, how can we engage with rather than exclude extremists from public discourse?
Mustafa, that sounds like a question for a professor. What do you think about the disinformation at the heart of these ideas?
I couldn't agree more with that YouTube comment that you just put up there. I mean, I think the internet is a primary source of fomenting dangerous, violent ideologies of all kinds of stripes. And it has a tendency towards an echo chamber kind of propensity. And that, I think, is extremely dangerous. I mean, we saw that, for example, with Anders Behring Breivik in Norway, who radicalized himself very much going down that hole and was connected to all kinds of far-right movements across the world. And that's the other side of this, is that, you know, we talked a lot during the global war on terror about the global nature of this threat that's there. But in fact, the right wing is also a global phenomenon. And it's not just an American phenomenon. And if we don't really understand the real primary threat that it itself has, then I think we're in some real trouble.
So Diallo, what do you think about the misinformation part of this? Do you think the U.S. government needs to do something about the misinformation that's out there, or is this left in the hands of the social media companies? Where do you go with this?
You know, on that question, I mean, I absolutely think that we have a challenge with, you know, the amount of misinformation and kind of organizing that's been happening online, and that social media companies need to be regulated and called to, you know, to account for some of that. Obviously, this also raises some real civil liberties concerns. You know, what do we really want Facebook to be in the business of deciding what is acceptable speech and what's not acceptable speech? That may be a conversation for another day, but we're seeing some real things about how far they're going, including, you know, considering adopting policies on anti-Semitism, for example, that actually would result in removing any criticism of Israel. But on the question of, you know, I think the social media questions are one set, and I'm really much more concerned about what kinds of theories are being put forward in the ranks of the agencies that are going to be tasked with doing some of this enforcement. And if you want to look at what you know, the real concern here is when you have agencies like at the FBI trying to explain, for example, Muslim radicalization and developing some really concerning and fundamentally flawed theories of how, say, a normal Muslim suddenly turns into a violent extremist. And I'm saying this with a sort of sense of irony, but unfortunately, we've seen documents about various theories that have been peddled to justify, you know, the sort of very expansive and broad-based and suspicionless surveillance of Muslim communities. And so it's with that background, the knowledge of that very long history, and I'm just giving an example of Muslims. We don't even have to talk about the sort of acrobatics that more recently even the FBI has done to try to designate violent extremists, you know, Black identity extremists, what it called Black identity extremists, to justify the surveillance of those kinds of political dissent movements. So it's with that knowledge of that background that I sort of bring deep suspicion of efforts of kind of law enforcement agencies, you know, to this idea that if we just gave them more tools, this time directing them at white supremacists, that they would get it right. I don't think that history shows us that that's how that happens. I think just you don't flip a switch and suddenly transform an agency. These are deep-seated, long histories with sort of ideological bases. And unfortunately, the problem or the word terrorism has come to equate Muslim terrorism, as some of the other panelists have said. So I just would really urge caution in going down that road.
Colin, can you jump in here? Diallo is saying that the government is part of the problem, that these agencies like the FBI and police, the police particularly who have been infiltrated by these right-wing extremists are the problem. So giving them more power only adds fuel to the fire. What do you think of her assessment?
It's just not that black and white. It's far more complex than that. We know for sure that there's been the presence of, racially and ethnically motivated individuals in law enforcement and the military. But the FBI, frankly, when it comes to domestic terrorism and white supremacy, has been the tip of the spear. They've been successful in infiltrating these groups in the 1990s and leading to the decentralization of the movement. And I think they're well aware, if you listen to what Director Wray has said, of the threat coming from individuals motivated by this kind of ideology. The FBI has open cases in all 50 states and is determined to track down individuals, involved in the Capitol insurrection. So, from where I sit, I think if law enforcement is asking for more tools, saying they don't have what they need, again, I'm inclined to listen to them, while at the same time, and I think, both of our guests have made really important points, and they're accurate. We have to learn from lessons of the past. Very often we talk about lessons learned. I think our British friends maybe have it more correct, which is lessons observed, right? Because we fail to learn these lessons. But I'm willing to give the Biden administration the benefit of the doubt and listen to some of the folks involved in, thinking about this very complex problem.
We're coming to the end of the show here, Mustafa. I want to hear what you think. Do you think that the FBI and the security forces in the U.S., do you think they have enough authority to do this? Do you trust that they'll handle this appropriately, or do you see a backlash on communities?
I think they have the authority. I think they have the authority. It's whether they have the will or not. And now it appear that they do have the will because it's become a politically active issue. But if clearly they have not had the will up until today, because it's now a live issue the way that it is. I mean, I can give you
But why today? Example. I mean, they blew up a federal building in the 90s. Where has this will been, Mustafa?
Exactly. That would be my question as well. Where has this will been? And not only that, I mean, it got diverted. Much of it got diverted to foreign terrorist organizations, so that they were in other kinds of laws, material support statutes, for example, were used heavily instead of just using the laws that were on the books. I can give you an example, if I may, very briefly. Mm-hmm. Many years ago, I was actually at a meeting with the FBI, with the local Muslim communities here in New York. And at one point, one of the FBI leaders then turns to the Muslim community and says, we're investigating the Muslim community the way that we investigated the Cosa Nostra, the Italian mafia. And I thought, wow, this is what an enormously problematic thing to say. First of all, it's as if the whole Muslim community is just part of a mafia family. And secondly, they're not investigating the Muslim communities the way that they investigated the Cosa Nostra. The way they investigated the Cosa Nostra was through the statutes that they have on the books, such as, racketeering or interstate commerce and those kinds of, statutes. Instead, the Muslim communities get national security letters, they get unwarranted surveillance, they get a whole host of other kinds of law enforcement tools that would not fly if in the domestic sphere. And so I really worry about expanding the reach of the FBI into the point where are we all going to just become vulnerable to being under the label of terrorism at some point?
I mean, clearly that anecdote, Mustafa, speaks to the lack of understanding the FBI has of the Muslim community in America. Maybe they understand this white supremacy community better. But that's our show for today. I want to thank Mustafa, Colin, and Diallo for joining us to discuss this. And Femi will be back with you tomorrow, and we'll keep watching this story on Al Jazeera as it breaks. Take care.